Hello, everyone. Welcome to our little lecture here. We're so excited to be meeting with you all today and to see some fabulous faces. We are Preservation Side B. Oops. And these are the lovely graphics that Eduardo has made with so much intention in them. And this is our lecture on hybrid preservation for a changing world.
Hi everyone, I am Eduardo and I am the half part of Preservation Side B with Taylor. And we're really excited to be here. Thank you, Terry and Mayra for putting this thing together for us. And our time together will be a mix of a lot of things. Like we have a lot of questions and we like to think of preservation as a way to think about yourself and the way that you introduce yourself to the world, right? Because preservation is this hybrid between your personal identity and the national identity or the social identity. So some of it will be us sharing our knowledge, and some of it will be us asking your opinion and your thoughts on some things on like storytelling and how to create this identity map that we are trying to create today. And we want you to focus in those three questions that we have in the screen now, like how do you express and celebrate your identity and heritage? What people tend to misunderstand about you when first getting to know you, and what context would you give them to have them understand you better? When you describe your past, what are 3 or 5 words that come up most frequently? So we're going to give you like a little bit of time to think about those questions. And you can write over there?
Yeah.
And maybe we can ask someone to answer the questions from the audience.
Does anyone in the audience feel ready to answer the questions about kind of how you describe your own past? Certainly for anyone in our audience, you can drop your words into the chat box. The 3 to 5 words that come up most frequently when you think about your past.
I mean, if we don't have a volunteer, I can volunteer myself if that's good, but I would love to hear from the audience. Do you have anyone in the chat saying anything? Where's the chat?
Right here. Nope, no chat.
Okay. So I'm gonna do it myself. How do you express or celebrate your identity and heritage? I am from Brazil, and as I know I have a fellow Brazilian in the audience today. I'm talking to Maíra. And in Brazil, we have a very different concept of heritage than in the United States. And I celebrate my heritage through Carnival, which everyone knows, I think. It's this big party in Brazil, and I just love the way people go out and celebrate our past and our history and how our culture was formed. So for me, this partying is the way that I celebrate my heritage and my identity. For the second question, what is something that people tend to misunderstand about me when first getting to know me? I am very quiet and I am an introvert. And a lot of people tend to think that this is like, I don't have passion or I don't care about things, but this is not correct. It's just that I am in my head, like thinking a lot and understanding a lot of things around me and just observing things. And when I describe my past, what are 3 to 5 words that come up most frequently? Well, I would say here in the context of the United States, Brazil would be the word because that's where I grew up. I would say family because that was the environment. Like we have a very strong family bond. And I would say, I don't know, happiness.
Ooh.
So those are the 3 words that come up frequently.
I love that.
Yeah.
Do we have a volunteer from our room?
Do we have any volunteers?
If not,
Mayra is ready to volunteer.
yay.
So the way that I express other talking a lot, maybe, about my culture and my country, just like similar to Eduardo and sharing all those things that happen. And the misunderstanding part could be because I talk too much. Maybe people get annoyed or think that Brazilians are too talkative, which we might be. And when I describe my past, the 3 to 5 words could be probably I grew up in a farm close to Brazilian, so probably nature, my family too, and friendship. I think will be available.
Yeah, those are good words.
Thank you.
Any other volunteers? If not, I can share mine. Okay.
Maybe if you do, Taylor, that will give others time to think about.
Think about it. Yeah. So how do I express my or celebrate my identity or heritage? I wrote down food. So one, I don't even like to cook. So it's not cooking food, but it's enjoying food. I love a lot of soul food. So I'm half Black, half white. So I love experiencing like the history behind food and Black culture. It's very important to me. So even though I might not eat like chicken because I'm a vegetarian, but I love the way, like the history that it has in our community and the way that it's cooked and the stories that go along with it. What people misunderstand about me, before this, I never really considered the word hybrid to like describe my past or anything like that, but that's how I would answer the last 2 questions here. So I think growing up and living in between 2 different cultures, it never really bothered me too much, or I never really thought about it oddly, but I think for other people, it was really important to like see me as these 2 things and always asking me how they clashed. And it's not something I thought about too frequently until I became older and was like interested in both parts of my heritage and seeing how those clash together. And then same thing with my past. I would describe it like as a hybrid, as this really beautiful blend of 2 things that could be at odds at some point, but made me a well-rounded person. So that is my share. I would love at least one more person to share with us. I know it can be a bit personal and we're not there with you in person, like sitting around the table, but we'd love to hear from you.
Oh, that's volunteer. Great. No?
Oh.
Introduce myself about my identity. I will think about who am I talking with. If I'm talking to a friend in the gym, maybe I will introduce about my personal life, what's my hobby and what's my life, my family life, something. If I'm meeting or talking with a colleague and from the work, I will talk about the majors and the work I have done, where I graduated, and what the projects we are doing. So I think there is a little bit different, but still I will share that where I come from. I'm, with different culture, with different background. I'd like to share some part of me, and I also like look for some common topics we have. So we all have some common interest starting point to start the conversation. So I think it's a part of, the keywords talk about my identity. I will think about what the topics will be.
Thank you, Chinyan.
Yes, thank you. And I think you perfectly transitioned us into our next point here, is thinking about the context, right? Like the context in which you describe yourself is so different. And we want to relate those ideas of like what all of these things mean in the context of preservation. So we can see that identity and context and narratives are really important qualities to understanding why equity and equality and justice really matter in our fields. And if you can't see your own identity or your own heritage in the places around you, and you don't have that context for it, that probably means that the preservation, the placemaking, the planning around you doesn't bring those things out, right? And if your surroundings are constantly being misunderstood or your narrative is being left out or told in insufficient ways, then the practices and the maneuvers that are supposed to be doing those things aren't equal or equitable or just. So our fields really impact how we see ourselves, how others see us, how we see others. It impacts our values and the context that's really essential to understanding our stories. And so we want to dive deeper into our identities as a group. So we're going to ask for some more volunteerism in just a bit.
Yeah, and when talking about context, it's important to talk about social location, right? So what is social location? Social location is this social position that each individual holds in the social fabric, and that we function with it within. Like we're gonna go through a map next, but I wanna explain before that if we think about like the United States, for example, our social location can be influenced by our gender, our race, our social class, our age, the ability of our bodies, the religion or orientation or sexual orientation, geographic location. So all those things, they contribute to this identity that we hold, and this identity puts us in a place within society. So it's very important when talking about preservation for us to locate ourselves in society, to understand how we can approach the work and how we can approach the universe around us. Because I think the first step for preservation is self-knowledge, right? You need to understand why something is important to you, for you to write down your statement of, what is the name of the statement? Statement of importance. So it's really, really important to acknowledge how our social location has informed our who we are. And so I think it can be helpful to think about social location by working through the answers in the way in which we identify for each of those social positions in the United States, because we are here in the United States talking about this social location. And this exercise can help us unpack how does our social location inform our professional life. And moving on, we're gonna do a little exercise here. This is the self ring, and I'm gonna give the credit to the psychologist Julia Jarrell. She introduced this self ring to me. So before we go into the next session and dive into the concept of hybrids in preservation, I really want us to dig into the idea of identity and to understand who we are and the values that we bring to our profession through the social location, through the social space that we occupy. So I'm going to start with myself and as an example, and then I will ask for some volunteers. I know this, as Taylor said, is very personal, but I would love to hear from someone. So I am an immigrant. I identify as an immigrant. I am a Black Latino. And in those identities, I can already see like a little bit of oppression in my social location. But I also identify as a cis male man. And this holds a lot of privilege, right, in our society right now. On the other hand, I am a gay man. So being a gay person today, it's easier than it was before, but it's still, there are some oppression in there. And I need to navigate the world thinking about how those things will show up in my context around me. My first language is not English. My first language is, and living in the United States, this puts me in a place of oppression, right? Because I need to think my brain needs to function in a different way that I grew up with. However, I speak fluently 3 other languages. So this gives me a lot of privilege because I can communicate better with different cultures. My body is completely able, even though I can read without my glasses. This is not a big deal for me. In my work environment, I fortunately have health insurance that I can update my glasses all the time. So all those external things, this external ring right here that we're seeing, they influence the core nature of who I am. And this is also informed by my experience growing up. That's why we asked about your past, like 3 to 5 words. Nature, meaning like the space, the environment that we grew up with, the contact that you have with nature. Was it like a urban environment? Was it nature? The nurture that your family was able to give you, the way you grew up, if you have any traumas, and all that will shape who we are and the way we approach the world around us. And I think this exercise is very important for us to place ourselves. And I would love to hear if someone has something to share about it, and if someone wants to do the exercise with us.
We've got this great looking graphic I've done here to represent Eduardo.
So Steve is willing to do this exercise. I'm quite impressed. You guys are asking, kind of a lot in a really interesting way. And so thank you, Steve. Do you want to share?
Okay, I figured out everyone else in this row has done it, so. So ethnicity, I consider myself Italian American. There are a few other things in there, but that's the main one. And that's what I like to eat. As I think that's important. Gender identity male, and sex male. Sexual orientation is gay, so that has been an issue at times. Race is white. Age, getting old, 58, and some days I really feel it. Religious, spiritual affiliation, kind of spirituality, I don't know. Definitely non-denominational. First language is English, but like Eduardo said, I can speak a couple other languages too. So that's a useful thing. Socioeconomic status, in the context of America, upper middle class. I grew up really not wanting for much of anything, and I have a good income now, so I can't really complain about anything. Disabilities, I have developed a disability. I have a hearing impairment, which does affect work, because especially with masks, it's very hard for me to understand people, even with my hearing aids. National origin, I grew up here, I was born here. I'm a Clevelander, so.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that was amazing. And we want this exercise to let us think about how we approach preservation or urban planning or placemaking, how we approach the city, the space that we are working with, based on the values that those experiences, the self-ring inform. So we want to start the lecture by giving us this context that preservation is a hybrid between who I am and who I am influences what I will preserve and how I will preserve things. And I think that was a great exercise, and we want everyone to start thinking about your social location before you approach your work, because those things will inform the values that you put into your work. And yeah, I think we can move on.
Okay. Thank you so much for being vulnerable with us. We know we're asking you a lot. We've never even met you before, so we really appreciate it. I want to discuss how that concept of identity comes to the concept of hybridity, which is something that we never really thought about until this. So thank you so much for that. When we think about the definition of a hybrid, or when I think about it, I would define it as these two pretty distinct things that really form together. They feed and they fuel one another to create something new, right? And that new product is something that has evolved to fit the needs of the present and the future. So we talked a little bit about identity. I talked about hybridity in my case here, but those blend of two things, right? Like Eduardo was saying, okay, I'm this thing and I'm this thing, so that creates this, but it also creates this. And I think that whole concept fits really well into the picture of what Eduardo and I consider to be the future of preservation. We want to create this hybrid method of preservation that better fits the needs of the present and the future. And so we can start to look at preservation from this hybrid lens by following, I think, the steps or the definitions of a hybrid. We can look at and acknowledge the original parts of the things that we want to blend and mix and twist together. So we can look at traditional preservation, how that's practiced, and then how we might practice preservation, or like the side B's of preservation, and merge those together so that it's preservation for a changing world, right? We're creating this hybrid piece.
And as you know, we are called preservation side B because we consider that traditional preservation, the side A's, that's how we call it, we want to do something different. We want to move away from this very mainstream preservation that preserves traditions and things that are based in white supremacy, and it overlooks some things in society that we value and we think it's important. And we want to do preservation that is geared more towards how we do preservation, how we look at the sites A's and site B's. And our goal is to highlight how we can merge side A's and side B's to create something that will work for the future. We are living in like a changing world, and we need to think about how preservation can preserve itself, right, and move forward, because the way it is now, preservation won't survive very long, because our society values different things now, and we need to think how preservation will fit in this future world by mixing traditional preservation, the side A's, with the side B's to create something completely different, completely hybrid, and something that will be future fit.
Can I pause for a second? So Eduardo made these graphics, and as we know, he's a genius. Can you explain
Sure.
like your thought process behind the three of these things and how that formed that?
Yeah, so I was thinking about hybrids, right? And that's a great word. Thank you very much, Terry and Maida, for giving us just this prompt. And I was thinking about science. So I went to look at scientific drawings and how hybrids were connected to agriculture and how people use different hybrids to create new products and new plants. And I started seeing like traditions, like indigenous traditions and plants and the tree crops growing together and how they create like this hybrid way to, they have like this hybrid approach to agriculture. So I decided to get the corn as a symbol for the Native Americans. And also the corn has a very, it's very connected to Latin America immigration. So I got the corn as a symbol for the Native Americans and the immigrants. And then I have the Statue of Liberty, because that's a symbol that it's also very much connected to what the United States wants to be represented as, like the land of the freedom and the land of the freed. We have an article, if you want to visit our website, called The Concepts of Freedom in the United States. Go to preservationsib.com. The article is there. And you can see that liberty in the United States is very much fundamented, rooted in white supremacy. So I got the liberty to represent this, the history of the United States being very much rooted in white supremacy, and how this narrative created like this idea of the immigration and that this is the land of the freedom. And also, like, being more current, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, we have all the protests going on, and something like a movement to fight for social justice. Also very connected to the story of the United States and how society wants the future to be. So I blended all those things together to create a hybrid, and that would be like considering all the history of the United States from the Native Americans to the way that we want the future to be. And that's the graphic.
Amazing. Brilliant. I had to shout that out because that was so great. He left me a voice memo that was like 3 minutes long describing that. I almost cried. So I love it. So let's look at the characteristics, or maybe the identities of side A's of preservation. So when I think about preservation, it's typically dealing in two facets, right? You're looking at a story and the identities behind that story and the way that it's told. And then two, you're looking at how you preserve that story. And I think traditional preservation tends to talk about stories with similar identities. They have mostly centered around white, straight folks, men and women, mostly men, and they have a pretty single narrative. And those stories are often rooted in place, right? And because those same stories tend to be told over and over again, you're able to have this attachment to place and narrative and identity. And I think that makes preservation a little bit easier, because we were just talking about the history of white supremacy in the United States. Like, a lot of that is rooted in property and place, things that side B's don't really get to have, or marginalized communities don't really get to have. And we are talking about how preservation has traditionally been practiced and continues to traditionally be practiced, how it started, how it's taught in schools, how it's used in big cities and by large organizations, and the way that the stories are told and the types of the stories that are told and having this narrow focus, this strictness to it that doesn't really lend itself to other types of narratives or other stories or other identities. And it might seem like I'm honing in and being really negative on side A's, and they definitely can be, right? But I think the really powerful thing about this traditional method is that that rigidity and that standardization has allowed preservation to have the strength that it does have. Like, that's a huge plus to say, here is exactly what preservation is. So there are obviously so many practices and characteristics that drive the traditional preservation that we're talking about. But what I want to stress is a few things that have fueled the non-traditional preservation and the things that make that thrive as well.
On the other hand, we have the side Bs, and the side Bs are very connected to the self-ring that we saw before, because side Bs, they do not have a place, right? When you think about a marginalized community and the history of marginalized communities, they are always moving because communities don't have property. They don't have like the ownership of the place. So it's very much related to storytelling. It's collective, and it's people-based because there is no place, there is no physical space to hold those stories. And there tends to be less standardization, that's a difficult word for me, standardization, and less practices that are formalized because you're dealing with intangible heritage, right? You're dealing with traditions, you're dealing with oral history, and all that. It's hard to have like a standard on how to protect all this. And that makes side Bs harder to reach and to make it legal in a way, to make it fit the standards that we have for preservation. But side Bs is not like something new. It's not something that we just discovered. Side Bs they've been there for like a long time. And we can see that through food traditions that Taylor was saying, people cooking and recipes being passed through generations. And how do you preserve that? Like, how do you preserve music? How do you preserve dances? And all that is being done by the communities and being done by people not trusting institutions. So they pass the knowledge of the side Bs all through oral history. I'm a little lost on my notes, just a second. So we want preservation side, like the side Bs, to be more popular and to be more valued in preservation. And we identify a super basic, like the characteristics. We have identified the basic characteristics of the side As and the side Bs. And but that's not the end of it. Like we're not done. We need to find a way to merge the side As and the side Bs to create something new and to create something that evolves both side As, like the standards and the place-based preservation, and the side Bs. They are not standard. They do not have standards, and they're people-based. So how do we do this? And we will start getting to our toolkit, like a little bit of a roadmap of questions on how to create a side C that is based on the side A's plus the side B's, and how to make this hybrid really work for us in the future. And I'm gonna ask you again, Terry, if you can unmute yourself again. What could a side C look like? It's like the documentation, the registration of intangible pieces. It's like video. It is, what do you think like a side C would look like?
Sorry, I'm here. I'm just playing with the technology. So does anybody in the audience want to respond to that? I have, when I was listening to you, kind of describing kind of the focus of intangible identity, storytelling and such, it made me really curious about what the weaving of those kinds of intangible ideas and the physical place-based work could mean when you bring them together. I do think that in the world of side A, that there's been more emphasis on that, at least maybe internationally, kind of the preservation of foodways or the preservation of cultural heritage, I think is, maybe becoming more accepted as a part of traditional preservation practice when we look at kind of the international preservation community. But I think here in the US, it might be a little more complicated because of the ways that, kind of marginalized populations, kind of there's friction. You probably noticed. And so that to me, I think is like a question that your work is getting to is how do we factor all of those things in? Because preservation side A, the sort of established reality, is hard to push against, and there's value in kind of at least, I mean, I started my career in historic preservation and we focused a lot, kind of on all of those very traditional things. And your work is providing a little window into another world. And I wonder if, maybe you could talk a little bit more about where you see it's going, and maybe that will spur some comments from our in-person or remote audience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you answered that question perfectly because we don't have an answer yet. Like it's just to get us to start thinking about these things, because I think we didn't really start thinking about how these things can combine together really until you asked us to talk about hybridity. And so this is kind of new for us, and this is more of a brainstorming session for us together. But I think we have some ideas on how we want to get there, and we'll continue and then we can kind of come back and talk. But I think in order to get to the side C, so we've got to do some work first. We really want to break down preservation and its stories. We want to look at the values that drive preservation and the values that drive the stories, right? We want to understand and identify the context and the identity and the perspective in which a story is being told, or where work is being done. And then we want to incorporate those findings into our practice. So I think this is where it begins. I don't think we just kind of come in and be like, let's try this and this and this. There's so many other things that we have to do first. And the way that Eduardo and I like to do this is by storytelling. So we're huge into storytelling. That's what we love to do. So Eduardo and I are going to tell each other and you all a story about our favorite thing of preservation. So I've chosen more of a typical side A. Eduardo will do a side B, and then maybe we can brainstorm together, like what could combining both of these things look like? Like how can we identify all of these things in both stories and combine them to make something that's a little strong? So I'm going to tell a real quick story on my favorite side A of preservation, which is the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters in Savannah, Georgia. Has anyone been to this museum before? Okay, cool. So it's pretty traditional side A. I happened to be walking around Savannah. I went on a solo trip there 2 or 3 years ago, and I just like fell in love with this whole story because I thought it was just fascinating. This house was built in 1819, so pretty early on in Savannah, Georgia, and it would have been like the top thing at the time. It was made with this bath stone with these really cool green shutters. That paint wouldn't have been very popular back then, and it belonged to a really rich and powerful man and family, and it got passed down to different powerful families who of course owned slaves. So when I went in here, obviously this was like the oldest looking building on the block here. And I did this presentation quite a few times on this house, but what really spoke to me about this area of this story of preservation is you come in, instead of going into the front of the house, you go into the back of the house. And you first go into the slave quarters, and they have this whole interactive thing that tells you about the history of the family and the history of like the enslaved people who lived with the family at the same time. And I had never seen anything like that. Like I had just graduated from my preservation program, never heard of that, and never heard of this kind of reinterpretation or actually seen it in practice. Like I had kind of heard about it, but it was amazing to see the house and the story from that perspective first. So you go in and you see this wooden crate bed, and it was just awful. Like these people are crammed into this house. And then I had, for the first time, learned of haint blue paint. So if any of you are not familiar with haint blue, it's used in a lot of African cultures, and enslaved people would use it as well. And it's supposed to ward off evil spirits. And if you are familiar with the porches in Georgia, folks actually use that haint blue paint in their porches in Georgia. So I thought that dichotomy of like using this this tradition that doesn't belong to you, and now it becomes this like white staple in the South, was very interesting. So you walk through the slave quarters, you go through these gardens, and they talk about how the gardens actually are not original to the actual house. They're created in what would have been like the period of significance at the time. So that's a random story of preservation that I was like, okay, there's so much so many methods of preservation happening here that it's this weird, big, jumbled mess. And then you go into the main house and you see these beautiful things that would have been so state of the art and so brand new at the time. So it's my favorite story of preservation. I always encourage people to go there because the tour guides are amazing. They really know so much about the history, and that the reinterpretation project is really, really essential to them, important to them. And I've spoke with one of the tour guides and she said it was a little difficult because some folks don't want to hear about that part, right? They come to see this house, they come to see this important story. So that's my favorite story, because I think there's so many methods of preservation going on. I think that they actually try to reinterpret in a way that's really important. So maybe kind of hinting at a side C, but there's still a lot missing there, right? Like there's still so much work that they have to do to be able to reinterpret all of this social history in this context. So using the little format that we talked about earlier, talking about values, I'm curious, I know I didn't tell enough of the story, but I'll just share what I think the values are in the preservation. I think they value really traditional preservation in a sense, like a lot of physical conservation, that's really important. Periods of significance were really important as well. It's landmarks, so that's really essential. And then I think they also value a reinterpretation and looking at stories from a different context. So it's not just the context of Savannah, it's not just the context of this really rich white man, it's how did he become really wealthy? Because he owned slaves, right? That was the only way that he was able to become so rich and powerful. So there's that context behind it. There's that perspective of not just the front house family, but the back house workers as well. And then traditional preservation practices that I've talked about. You can see the little plaque up there. It's landmarked, it's very protected. It has a lot of money because it's part of the Telfair museums that are along Savannah, Georgia. So that's my story. Any questions on my story? Anything else anyone wants to know? Okay, great.
So moving on to like a side B in preservation, I'm going to talk about Chinatown in New York City. And when we look to the history of Chinatowns in the United States in general, we know that in 1850s, something big happened in the United States, and that was the gold rush, right? And it brought a lot of folks from the West all over. And some of those folks were Chinese immigrants who came to the U.S. to head to California, but some folks settled in New York City too. Like after the gold rush, a lot of people came, and some of them came to New York City. And the first Chinese immigrants actually started to settle around Mott Street in Park Row. I don't know if you're all familiar with the geography, the maps of New York City, so I'm not gonna get into super detail about it. But the Chinese population started like to settle down and be together, especially because right after the gold rush, when all the immigrants came, the racism started to show up, and the racism started to show up not only in the streets, but also in laws and in it was implemented as a law. So we have the Chinese Ban Immigration Act. Yeah. So we have the Chinese Ban Immigration Act, and that is really like a law that makes racism like institutionalized racism in the United States. And we see, as I said before, like marginalized communities, they're always moving in the map, right? And we have this encroachment, this part of the neighborhood, this part of the city that all the Chinese population decided to settle. And we see a lot of effort to move them away from where they are, right? And there is a very good video on YouTube. So if you go on YouTube and you put Vox Chinatown, the video will explain very well what happens with Chinatowns in the United States. So this population is suffering a lot of pressure to move away from the city center, right? Especially because white supremacy do not want Chinatown to be in there. Because when the Chinese population settled down and they started to open their own businesses and they started like to create their own community, they got strong and they got famous, and people, they were like making money. And that's a threat to white supremacy, right? Like, how can Chinese people come here and make money? This is unacceptable. So there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot of racism, there was a lot of violence, and this reflects in the urban settlement of the Chinese population. So there is the pressure for them to move away from the city, and a very wise man had the idea to make Chinatown look like a Chinese city or something similar to a Chinese city. Because making this like an amusement park, like a Chinese amusement park in the middle of San Francisco, it will generate money for the city, and by generating money for the city, you allow the Chinese population to stay there, right? And so this is something very interesting in preservation, because this marginalized population is allowed to stay there if they change their landscape to mimic something that Americans think China looks like, to generate money for the city itself, right? So it's not thinking about the Chinese population, it's not thinking about their well-being, it's thinking about how can this generate money for white supremacy. And moving on, we see that the values that we see in Chinatown, it's not because of this is important for the Chinese immigration in the United States, the history of Chinese immigration in the United States. It's not because of the value that the Chinese population brought to New York City and to the United States in general, but it's basically because they were able to generate money for the city, right? They were able to create this amusement park. And that's why Chinatowns are now a staple in every big city in the United States. The context, when we think about the context, there is all this immigration, there is the story of the immigration of the Chinese population to the United States, but also all the racism that they suffer with, like institutional acts, like the immigration ban, and how this plays a role in the way that the Chinatowns, they are inserted in cities around the United States. So it's very interesting to look how, and also like many Chinatowns around the United States are not preserved yet. I think Ohio has a very big issue, right, with their Chinatown. Here in New York City, Chinatown is kind of preserved, but not really. We have some individual landmarks, and we have a lot of people fighting, like community-based organizations fighting for the preservation of Chinatown. But as we see, it's not like it's not an institutional preservation. It's community-based, it's people-based preservation. And that's very different from what Taylor just told us, that building has the history, has the perspective, and it's all recognized as something important for the United States. While in Chinatown, we have all these Chinese immigrants coming here and like building empires and generating wealth for the country, and generating also like cultural wealth for the country. But this is not recognized as important as much as the side A's of history. And we want to think about like, how can we mix those things together? How can we look at those values and compare them and create something that will come up for the future? And I think like once we get to the root of how side Bs are preserved, we can start incorporating those things to the side A's and create something that will look like a side B for the future. So again, like what a side C could look like if we look at the values inside Bs and how the perspective plays a role and how these marginalized communities are always moving. There is no sense of place. There is no physical space for marginalized communities, and how all those things play a role in the side A's. How can we think about a side C, something that will be place-based, but also people-based, something that will be standardized, but also not like so tied to standards. And yeah.
Any questions for Eduardo? I have a question for Eduardo, but we can go audience questions first.
Are there any questions, either in the room or in our remote audience?
Oh, Andrew, I'm just now seeing your chat. Thank you for participating. Eduardo, I'm curious, do you know what the background, the racial or ethnic background was of the architect who came up with the idea to make Chinatown more Disney-like?
Yes, he was a white man.
Okay.
So
I was gonna say, like, 'cause it could be sort of like interpreted as an act of self-preservation if it came from the community, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, that makes more sense. And then when we were talking about place, I was thinking about, we normally say like, oh, there's not a lot of place that marginalized communities have. That's not true, right? Like we do have a lot of places
Yeah.
that traditionally haven't been preserved. And the more I'm thinking about it, the more place is really essential to me. Like the feeling I get when I go to a house museum or see something that is really, really historic and old is so special, right? And I think that's the way that I fell in love with historic preservation. I want to feel that way about people who look like me and you and other people that I don't see often. And so that side A is really essential to me. But I've been really struggling with like, okay, I have this feeling that I want to have when I like talk about the history of soul food. And I also want to have that feeling when I am like touching some historic brick, right? Like how do I combine those two? And I don't know, I'm still struggling with how to do that because I think those values are so different. They're not at odds, I would say. Like sometimes they can be, that context and that history and that perspective is at odds, but I think the values are very much the same. Like I still value history, I still value heritage, and I still value this impact that history has had on us as a culture, as a society, and as me as a person. But I haven't been able to figure out a way that eases that tension that like currently exists between both of those things. Like that's where that hybrid is clashing for me. Those are just my thoughts. But.
Yeah, I think a very good way to think about it is to think about joy. Like how joyous do you get when you see a place where the preservation is like flawless? And I'm thinking about the French Quarters in New Orleans, for example. You go there, you know where you are. You have this feeling, and everything it looks like it should be, and everything looks perfect, and that brings you a certain kind of joy that is different. And I think preservation is all about this joy that people have. And how can we translate this joy of preservation, of preserving like a physical space, to something that is not exactly, doesn't have a space?
Oh, remember when we went to Richmond, Virginia? You just reminded, we went to Richmond, Virginia together, and there was this kind of not great preservation of the slave trail, but then there was this beautiful little memorial, and you could write something, you can create something, and you can leave it as an offering. And I love that. I forgot about that, but I think that's a really cool blend of like, that's some traditions that we wouldn't consider to be side A, right? Like this concept of offering. So it blends in those two cultures, and it's along the trailway. So it's not just like having a plaque, right? It's something physical. It's like participating in that intangible piece along the place, right? It's doing people and place together. I'm gonna write that down. Any comments from anyone else?
I would say that like what you were just talking about kind of makes me think about the opportunities for new ways of thinking about the preservation of historic landscapes, which has always been kind of a field that's been mysterious to me because the landscape, of course, constantly changing. Buildings change too, but landscapes change faster, and so like how then, kind of what really triggered for me was that one of our speakers about a year ago, Pico Mandela Gray, who is a religion scholar at Syracuse, one of the things he talked about were hush harbors, these kind of outdoor places where enslaved people would go to, kind of celebrate their spirituality at the risk of their own lives, because people would be killed for leaving, kind of their quarters to go to these places, kind of outdoors in nature, had to be quiet and had to be secret. So I'm not even sure, kind of whether there's a documentation of where some of these places of congregation even were, much less, kind of something you could put a plaque on, if you know what I mean. But I mean, that story that he told was so compelling, this idea of a place in nature that allowed people to be free in a communal sense and to be spiritual. That was so important to them that they did this at great peril. And I think that that's a story and a place that's worthy of acknowledgement. I don't know what preservation even means in that context, but I guess what I'm saying is that in the listening to you kind of talk about your work, I think that there's tremendous potential to think about the ways that we, kind of embrace the stories that are embedded in landscape.
Yeah, I think also thinking about like landscapes is one thing that I noticed is the institutionalization of history kinds of kills it a little bit. So talking about Carnival, for example, in Brazil, something that I can speak of. Carnival is a street party, right? People go to the streets and celebrate Carnival. And then once in the 50s, the government decided to ban those parties in the streets and build like a arena for it to happen. So you have like a specific place that those marginalized communities that celebrated Carnival will go to, and they're only allowed to celebrate in there. So how this institutionalization, this is the place of your history, how this like kind of kills a little bit of the history of it. And I think like looking forward to the future, something that a site C will look like is just give up on their standards. Just let's do each case, it's one way. For example, those the Hirsch Harbors, we can think about a preservation that will be specific to their landscape and to what happened there, instead of just like putting a plaque and being like, this is the this is in the national register, and this and this, and you have to preserve this place, this and this way. So I think looking at site Cs in the future, I don't see institutions and I don't see rules on how to preserve things. And I think this is, my 2 cents for the site C for the future.
So no side A's.
Yeah.
So side B. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking about what that would look like for me. And I would argue, like, I want the documentation. I want that to be there for people who like that story and are like, all right, this is protected. This is ours, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. Is there any other questions? I know we only have like 8 minutes together that you have for Eduardo and I about the presentation, about the work, any thoughts or comments you want to share?
Steve has a question.
Let me take my mask down for it. So this requires a little bit of a preface. I have a friend who's a sociologist, Gregor Mattson, who has done a lot of work on gay bars around the country, including in small towns. Many of these bars are very embedded in their community, whether it's a small community or it's in a big city. And they're often really threatened by gentrification and being priced out of their location, or the guy who's owned the bar for 50 years is dying. One of the things that he talks about is this notion of sort of legacy business protections, which I think is important for the same reason that Terry said, because even like intangible heritage designations, they tend to assume that the heritage they're designating doesn't change anymore. It's a form of dance that someone's going to pass down, and it's a national treasure or whatever. And what's the period of significance for a gay bar? Is it the disco era? I don't. It's the period of significance is the person who's finding it and needs it right now as a refuge. This notion of sort of protecting places or areas or blocks, and saying you can do certain kinds of development in them, but only if you leave these businesses, only if you let these people do their thing there. It's a very hard thing to write into law, I suspect, but it's a really interesting idea. I wondered what you thought.
Yeah, I actually did my thesis at Pratt on legacy businesses. Yeah, so I picked a couple in Bushwick and in Bed-Stuy that were Latinx owned, Black owned in the neighborhood. And then I talked about I gave context, like, well, what's the context? How have they historically been pushed out of the neighborhood? What kind of loans were given to them and things like that. And I absolutely agree. Like, you have to jump through all of these hoops though to get like a legacy business thing. And so I thought about what it would look like from a business perspective, from a people perspective, if you're thinking about the context of like change, right? So I have like these new hip kids coming in the neighborhood that are like mostly white and like middle class, right? Like what does that look like to kind of embrace these parts of this community that you're coming into, and what is it like to stronghold, like keep your community that other people are moving into? So it was more of like a social experiment. So I went and sat in the businesses and the bars and things like that. And I observed the different ways that people interact in their community as it's changing. And there was this really beautiful bar. It's actually really ugly called Tip Top. The social interactions there were mind blowing. Like it was a historically Black owned bar. It had been a shoe store, Italian American owned in the 40s. And then there was these constant changes to it. And it was a Black men only bar. And then the daughter took it over and she was like, we're gonna stop this men only thing. But then it's so essential to Pratt, which is very close to it, for students who want to go drink like $3 beers. And so it's this weird little place where all of the like that preservation is still happening, and you've got like community people from their proms, like their pictures are everywhere on like this community board, and you've got like people important in the community, Black, white, whatever, all over the place. And I think that is like an essential piece of preservation, right? It's like this combination, it's constantly fluid, it's constantly changing, but you also have this protection from like the city as being a legacy business, right? I think it's such an strange thing to quantify.
Yeah.
And I still couldn't do it in my thesis. I was like, here's what it looks like. I don't know what it means, but like, I think this is cool. Like there's some places that have been here for a long time that are not changing because they're not embedded in their community and the changing community. And so they're gonna die. And then there's these really new places that people who have been in the community for a long time feel like they have no business doing. But that Tip Top bar was just like so perfectly in the middle because it was so community based that it was just a perfect way of preservation. I think it had both the physical, it had that place because it was really important, and it had the people at the same time.
Yeah, I think an important piece for us to think about this like change and how to embrace change is to get to the realization that preservation is both side A's and side B's. They're people based, right? They're a reflection of the values of people, and we need to understand that people and society and the values that we have change. So I think a good thing to think about in preservation is how we can get the standards done, but also allow it to change over time and to be like, all right, we have this bar, it was Black men only, we have the documentation of it. What is the future of it? Can we document what is happening now? And like having preservation being a process instead of having a point in the history of it, being like, this needs to look like this forever, and just getting it to be like, let's do the timeline of this place, and let's see how it changes, and let's see how it reflects the society, the community that this business or this building or this landscape is in, and how we can just allow things to change. Because as it is right now, we have this period of significance, we have people deciding how things should look like, and that's how we will look like forever. And I don't think this is a reflection of our society, because our society changes. As we saw, like freedom in the United States changed, like the concept of freedom. What is freedom today is completely different when we got the liberty, the Statue of Liberty. So I think we need to still have the standards, but make it like people based, and people change, so the standards should change too. Yeah.
We only have 1 minute.
I think a quick note about the side C too is empathy, and they acknowledge that yes, you have the side A and you have the side B, but you can always combine both things together, and not only for preservation, but also for our society and how we move the world in the future.
Thank you. That I think is a really good summing up, Mayura. Thank you, Taylor and Eduardo, for a really provocative and impressively interactive session. Could everyone join me in thanking Taylor and Eduardo for joining us today? Thanks so much. We're going to have to find a way to continue this conversation. So.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us both remotely and in person, and to remind you that the next speaker in our series is next week. That's Marlon Davis, who's going to be giving a talk on virtual disruption, a post-disciplinary practice. So I hope you'll all be back next week. Thanks again, Taylor and Eduardo. We really appreciate it.
Bye.